Go ahead and start recording. Thank you. Perfect. All right. Well, again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's conversation about the batch and build method, the batch and build approach. I am Kate Hansen with the Center for Rural Affairs based here in Nevada, Iowa. And I'm really excited to be joined by John Swanson, who is officially Water Resources Supervisor for Polk County, but probably could tack on a few more titles to that. He wears many hats. And we're really excited to chat today over the lunch hour about an approach that John and partners and collaborators have pioneered in Central Iowa to implementing conservation practices, and specifically practices that have positive impacts on water quality. John is going to tell us about what that approach is. But what I can tell you is that I think it really can be a great source of pride for us here in Iowa. It came out of Iowa. It came out of the watershed management authorities and many other collaborators. And really just something that is a model that can be replicated in so many different ways. John, I know you're getting calls from other watersheds in other states. I think you're going to tell us a little bit about that, but just really an approach that is cutting edge and kind of charting a new path for how do we get some of these practices that we all care about out there on the ground. So really, in terms of housekeeping, we'll keep this pretty conversational. We're trying to keep it under an hour, maybe around 45 minutes. We'll hear from John about what he's got going on, what lies ahead, some best practices there. And if you have questions throughout, I encourage you to throw them in the Q&A box. We probably will leave them to the end. I want to leave enough time here at the end for questions for John, but throw them in whenever you've got them, and we'll start making our way through when we get to Q&A. So with that, John, I'm ready to hand it over to you. Introduce yourself and let's get this going.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. Like Kate said, the batch and build, it's a term that's really taken off. I feel like I've been on a roadshow talking to a lot of people about it. But something I really enjoy talking about, because me as a conservationist, as a watershed coordinator, it's really changed a lot of my mindset. The effectiveness just keeps proving its value. So I'm just going to walk through, tell a little story of how the project came to be, what we learned, and how we're applying it to other practices. And knowing, like I personally coordinate for several WMAs, like I think there's very specific things that WMA could take away from this. And as Kate reached out, we're like, yeah, I think we could pose this as like a way that WMAs could get more projects on the ground, and it's that simple. So to kick things off, who am I? I've been a watershed coordinator in varying degrees. I still go out and climb into mud pits. I now spend more time in the office than ever before, which I kind of miss the fun outdoor stuff. But at the end of the day, my job is still to find projects, find funding, get projects on the ground, improve water quality, reduce flooding. It's really that simple. Everything that my team does is based around find good projects and get them built. And when I say about WMAs, so I'm here in Polk County in Central Iowa. We have, these are the 4 WMAs that I actively help coordinate, ranging from Beaver Creek, which is a bigger one there, going up into Boone and Greene and Dallas counties, to some very urban watersheds like Walnut Creek, to some extremely flood-prone watersheds like 4 Mile Creek, to Mud Camp Spring, which is in eastern Polk County, which is very agricultural, less than 10% urban over there. So we do a lot of different things. We do urban stormwater. We leave the city and we're in the ag environment very quickly. And we've had some recent success, specifically talking about saturated buffers and bioreactors. I won't take too much time, but we know these 2 practices, they treat tile outlets, they reduce nutrients, they're underground. If you've ever been to a field day and looked at a saturated buffer, it's kind of lame to look at. Like there's nothing there. It's just underground. But for years, we've been working to try and get these installed in some of our watersheds. And there's been some barriers, to just be totally honest. I joke that we did it wrong for a lot of years, and it was not from a lack of effort. I will tell you that. So in these 3 watersheds specifically, we've been working to try and get folks to install saturated buffers and bioreactors since 2015. In the first 5 years of us trying to do that, we installed 6. In fact, I still remember vividly the year we installed both the bioreactor and a saturated buffer, and I was like feeling really good. I was like, we got this figured out now. But unfortunately, like in 4 Mile Creek, our watershed plan says a goal of treating 100 tile outlets. Kind of took a step back and I'm like, man, we're not going to reach that goal anytime soon. And that was even with we had high kosher rates up to 100%. We did field days, we did outreach, we looked at lots of sites, but we were not getting people to the finish line. And that was just the truth of the matter. And so for the first time, we actually took a step back and we really started asking ourselves questions. Why were these practices not being installed? And some of it came down to, like, not to downplay the conservation planning, but this idea of walking a field and investigating all these different problems and coming up with solutions almost always drove landowners and farmers to erosion-based practices or practices that help their agricultural goals. These two practices specifically, they just never rose to the top, like for obvious reasons, because it doesn't improve yields, it doesn't help your fix an erosion issue. So they were getting lost in the conversation around other practices. We had a lot of miscommunications from state and federal programs about how they could be applied. Tax considerations, getting cost share to install a practice that purely improves water quality. Getting taxed for that at the end of the year was an issue for some landowners. But all in all, the one thing that really stuck out to us was this idea of a hassle factor. Like, people were well-intended and they wanted to participate, but it was just, they were busy folks. They had maybe 2 jobs, they had kids going to soccer practice, like really busy people. And the hassle of trying to do conservation was not getting them to the finish line. And that's where I've sprinkled in a few lessons, because I love to do this in presentations, because it's kind of how my brain works. And the first lesson that we really stuck out to us now looking back is that a lot of times money and interest from landowners are not the most important barriers. In fact, we found that for saturated buffers and bioreactors, time and convenience were incredibly important for landowners. Like, they were really interested. In some cases, they were even willing to pay for it, but they needed it to be simpler for them. And as I asked folks, like, to really think about, like, what are your barriers for whatever your goal is? We found that we have a big question that we try to find the right time and place to ask it. But truly, if you can get to a time and place where you can ask a landowner or a farmer, like, what would it take to get you to install these practices? And if you're in a safe space where you can ask that question, those answers are really powerful. And you can also ask yourself that question: what would it take to get these practices in the ground, or to do dozens of them? How do we really ramp things up? You have to find your way to ask those hard questions. And so we asked all those hard questions, and we didn't know it at the time, but there was a chance meeting between a local SWCD commissioner, a watershed coordinator, and a local ag business leader. And they had an idea. They said, these saturated buffers are not taking off like we hoped they would. What if we took a much more targeted approach and we methodically targeted landowners? Maybe we came up with a new funding model that took some of the pressures off of them. What if we grouped sites together and bid them out in groupings, and even provided a landowner incentive payments? Like, this idea of a very focused efforts. And that's really where it all started. And like happens, that watershed coordinator, she took another job, and it kind of fell on my lap, this idea. And I was like, this really actually makes sense to me as a conservationist. And that's where it started. We, for the first time, we mapped out fields. We used the ACPF tool, which many of you may have heard of. Like, I'd seen these maps for years, and I never really knew how to use them. And so we said, let's look at every field that has potential saturated buffers, and let's prioritize them, and let's come up with a priority list of fields that we want to talk with those landowners and say, we want to work with you. And that's, again, looking back, lesson number 2, for the first time, like, really targeting landowners, targeting priorities, and really creating a list and setting a goal. And so for me, as like a WMA, it really came down to, like, for any WMAs, not just saturated buffers or bioreactors, but for your WMA, like, what is your priority? If you were to boil it down to one priority, what is it? And then once you know that priority, find a tool, because there's great tools out there to map and target specific fields, create a list of landowners. And I always joke, don't call it a hit list, but essentially you created a hit list. I want to go and talk to every one of those landowners where you think you have a high chance of that practice working, and be like, we want to work with you on this specific priority, which was very different than anything we'd ever done before. And again, connecting the dots, we've all done lots of field days. Personally, like, we kept doing field days, we kept having the same 10 people come and a bunch of agency folks, and we weren't getting practices on the ground. And it became clearer and clearer that, like, field days were not doing it for us. Could we do targeted outreach to hit those specific people? And then we, again, trying to look at doing things better. We understood, a lot of landowners told us that every time they called the office, they get a different answer. They don't know who to talk to, a lot of indecisiveness. So from day one, we said every landowner on our list, we're going to assign them to a project manager. That project manager is going to do the initial outreach, and they're going to guide them all the way to construction. They're the only person they ever need to talk to. And if that person doesn't know the answer, they go find the answer. And so now a couple years later, we've had Ruth McCabe with Heartland Co-op, Tanner Polis, who was a district employee, now with Idols, Keegan Colt with ADMs. They've all been project managers and all have been very successful. And then outreach began. So we had the idea, let's mail every landowner a map and say, we want to work in your field. It's been mapped. We want to target your tile outlets. You see on the picture on there on the right, we had dozens of addresses that weren't even correct. But what was different is we sent this letter and we said, this project manager is going to call you within 1 week. In fact, like Tanner's going to call you and you can expect to call. And if by chance they actually open the letter, you had a chance to kind of get in the door. And our request is very simple. We just want to know, hey, we really want to work with you. Our goal is to make it really easy for you. Can we survey your field? And that's where things all really started. And lo and behold, people were really receptive to this. Like they appreciated that we had done a lot of the legwork and that they just needed to give us permission to go out and see if this would work. And there was no commitment. It was just, let's go out in your field. And before we know it, we had over a dozen landowners that said yes. We had different tracts of land. We had different tiles. First time we had to really get organized, and this was our first attempt, which we had a giant dry erase board, which filled up very quickly. And then we learned how to actually get organized. And we developed a spreadsheet system for every tile that we surveyed. If it made it to a green, it made it through preliminary design. If it made it to a dark green, it made it to the final. If for whatever reason the landowner didn't move forward or the design didn't work, it went to a red. And we developed a system so anybody could know the status of every tile at any given time. And along the way, so like we have a dozen landowners telling us yes. We had to learn how to survey more efficiently. We set a goal of now that we've really honed it in, like we have a goal of 1 trip to survey a tile, to survey a field. We survey every tile and we never have to go back. Minimizing trips made us a lot more efficient and make designs that anyone could, or surveys that anyone could design from, because designers are hard to come by and they're really busy. So we wanted to be very efficient with their time. And that brings us to I would say the most important lesson for this batch and build idea to work. The key is that it's going to take a team of people or one person that's entirely focused on this batch and build. And whether it's multiple people or one person, you have key roles, and whether it's for saturated buffers or any other practice, the roles include like outreach and landowner contact, like a person that a landowner can be the point of contact for, the surveyor, the designer, and project manager. If you have a team, is really key because someone has to hold everyone else accountable. And so I've been working in other counties and helped to basically create new teams, it's really important for your watershed to understand who are your resources. Who are the people that are already working in your watershed? But even more important than that is who's motivated. Like who, I hate to say, but who's not kind of a burnt out government employee? Who wants to really make a difference? That could be NRCS, it could be IDOLS, it could be private conservation of ground, it could be a city water staff, it could be conservation. These are all people that we've integrated onto our team because they're motivated and like want to be a part of getting projects on the ground. So for these watersheds, you really have to think about who are the resources and who could possibly be the surveyor, who knows how to design or who could learn how to design. In some cases, it could be one person. And in our case, we do a lot of other projects. It's like, this is a portion of what we're doing each day. And then again, in our part of our story was we had to learn how to design these properly. Prior, we were generally seeing about a year to get a single design back. Not acceptable for like a landowner to wait for a year to even know what will work. So although it can be complicated for lots of reasons, we were able to work with an NRCS designer that first year who was able, like when he focused and we gave him a bulk of surveys, he was actually able to complete 90 feasibilities in a 6-week period. So we were able to present back to those landowners like what would work in their field and have a real sit down with them. And then we actually accomplished doing 60 full designs in 6 months. And I would say we were able to do that by really making them a part of the team and like being very efficient with their time. And since then, we've also dove into consultant designs, which on average is around $2,000, $2,500 a site. But we were able to bring a consultant on also and make them a part of the team, which was very new for us. That's a lot better than a year for one design. And then, So imagine now we're like, we did outreach, we targeted landowners, we called them, we asked for them to let us into their field and survey. We surveyed over 100 sites that first year. We got preliminary designs, we presented to the landowner. The next piece that we were kind of figuring out in this hodgepodge this first year was to try and do something different with a new funding model. And so I call it the conventional funding program, which is like a cost share. So a landowner signs up for cost share, they get approved, they go hire the contractor, they complete the work, they get reimbursed the funding. We all know you can stack different funding sources. That's what we were doing for a lot of years. And right off the bat, we knew we wanted to do 100% cost share for this practice because it's just truly a water quality practice. There's no benefit to the landowner. But when you throw that on a chart for the first time, it gets incredibly complicated. So when we first started, we're like, okay, we have state, federal, and local dollars. If we got the landowner sign up for all of these, we could get 100% cost share. They'd hire the contractor. But you can see how many arrows are going to the LO, the landowner, which with every one of those arrows comes more paperwork. Also, then they're going to be taxed for all of that. It's just a lot, right? It's complicated. And so then we came up with this idea. We actually learned this from some folks doing wetlands with the Iowa watershed approach was, what if the county operated as the fiscal agent? And we got those state and federal partners to give the money to the county. The county then put all that in a pool of money and we bid out these projects in groupings. We also had the question of how does a county hired contractor go onto private lands? And we learned all about a temporary construction and access easement, where it's a temporary easement. We come onto the land, we build the practice. When it's all done, the landowner signs up, we leave, and it's a privately owned practice. And for ours, we always had this idea of incentivizing landowners. And so we offered $1,000 payment, a temporary easement payment for each tile that we treated. And one of the other beauties of this is the funding for building the structures never goes to the landowner, so they don't have to be taxed. So say one landowner installs 10 saturated buffers and bioreactors, that might be $90,000. They don't have to face that tax considerations. So then boom, again, not super, still rather complicated, but the key here is if you see the landowner, all they're really signing is a temporary construction easement and a maintenance agreement. All those other arrows go to the fiscal agents. So like we're taking care of a lot of the complexities behind closed doors and we're not bothering the landowners. And we could ideally group sites together because sometimes we're even having trouble finding a single contractor to build, say, one saturated buffer. So if we had the idea, if we could group them together, we could possibly make it better for contractors. And then boom, lesson number 4 of 5, 5+1. Truly what we've learned about this fiscal agent funding model now several years in is it truly makes conservation more convenient. Now, for me personally, as a conservationist, I've really enjoyed sitting down with dozens of landowners at their kitchen table explaining the program to them, explaining how the funding is going to work. And what they keep saying time and time is, absolutely, I'd love to participate. Why wouldn't I? And like we created this program that's like, oh, why wouldn't you do this? And what's interesting is I've talked to the state and the feds, and there's always these questions like, what are WMAs and what are they really trying to do? Well, what WMA has done in this case is it's created the perfect platform to talk about how do we do things different. And in our WMAs, like taking the state and federal funding, giving it to a government agency that's a part of the WMA, which is a local fiscal agent, it's equated to more projects on the ground. So it's worked out very well. And every WMA is different and every county is different. But this idea of simplifying it for the landowner has increased our adoption rates. And then boom, all this is for naught if you don't get results. So we rewind back to that like third slide. We did 6 installs in 5 years. Our first year we did 51 installs in Polk County. Round 2, 2022, we did 85 installs. Gearing up for this year, a continued expansion. And now kind of our role is to try and help our neighboring counties. So every county is different. That's become very clear. Every team is different. But what has been interesting is in every county we've worked, the landowners appreciate the simplicity of how this works, and treating their tile outlets inside buffers is a really low-hanging fruit. And they've shown a willingness to own and maintain it after the project is done and gone. But as I've learned, no project is perfect. Like honestly, there's always going to be issues, and we've had our surprise hurdles along the way. So the things that complicate our lives daily include Like cultural resources, we have to make sure we do our due diligence, which includes, this was a change about 2 years ago, which equated to us digging about 300 holes and sifting the dirt. But hey, when you have a team, we got 6 of us together and we broke into teams of 2, and we dug well over 100 holes in just one day in one circumstance. Issues are going to happen. You're going to dig a hole to install a you're probably going to find another tile you didn't know was there. But again, by having a good designer that's a part of your team, you figure this out. I've become an expert at stressing out our accountants by bringing in lots of funding sources, but the thing that keeps happening is if you drum up demand, the funding tends to follow suit. And if you have a funding need, it's amazing that what you can find if you have projects truly ready to go on the ground, which does stress accountants out, it's good to have them around. And so here, kind of as we wrap things up on this idea of batch and build, and again, it's a process, and like understanding your process is really important to communicate with landowners. You have to set expectations. And so what we didn't know this the first 2 years, but now it's become very clear. And this is truly how we operate is you target your fields in January, say you come up with your list, you outreach to them in February and March when they're probably at home and not busy in the fields. You get permission to survey. In that spring season is the perfect time to find tile outlets. June and July, we're completing feasibility, and we're having then a follow-up, our second touch with the landowner, where we're going to sit down with them and present what would work in their fields. And for the first time, we want to get a garner, like, is this something you really can see having in your field? If not, like, no worries. But this will work and we can do it. And then if they say yes, we truly kick into full design, which takes 6 months. That just is what it is if you have a bunch of sites. And we update the conservation plans. We do the cultural resources. We do all the stuff behind closed doors. And then boom, the following February, about a year after you first called them, you sit down with them and they sign all the paperwork. Then we bid out the projects in a grouping. We've done groupings as big as 50 sites. And then boom, you start construction in May. And we usually put a deadline by December. And while that starts, you start the second round. And it's this revolving door of, in this case, saturated buffers and bioreactors. And that leaves us our last lesson that's truly stuck out to us is whatever the practice is, whatever the programs are, is kind of pencil out like a timeline and an implementation schedule. Because what you have to do, imagine now it's like a 2-year process. How do you keep an ongoing sense of urgency? And you do that by setting goals and deadlines and continuously meeting those. So it's like, boom, we've all had a team meeting. We all have to go do our thing. We're going to meet again in a month. We got to have this done to keep this process going. Unfortunately, we've done progress now where if you don't meet those deadlines, you will see the success start to unravel because you don't meet landowner expectations. It's all interconnected. And I wrap things up with major takeaways. In our case was you roll into a field. We have this mindset that while we're here, we want to treat every single tile that's possible. Like we don't ever want to have to come back. We just want to be done with it and move on to the next field. Across the board, we've seen things benefit from this bundling approach. Rather, like we can survey 10 sites in a day. We used to survey 10 in a season. Design, super beneficial. Surprise, consultant design, I was really worried about hiring consultants, but they've done a good job. There's a cost to it though. And we had some big questions whether that $1,000 payment was worth it. The cost analysis showed that we actually saved so much money on construction by grouping sites together that it was worth it. It was positive. The thing that really helps, that the most important part of that payment is it provides that person who's making that initial cold call a reason to get somebody kind of excited and intrigued right off the bat. It's really beneficial. But all this comes down to how effectively can you build a team? And I joke, there's a final lesson. If I like batch and build in a nut, all batch and build is you build a team, you prioritize something, whether it's a water quality goal or a specific practice. You map out the sites where that should work. You methodically outreach to those landowners that have those fields. You develop a funding mechanism that makes it easier for the landowner, and then you group sites together. And like thinking about this all in a WMA perspective, like I always think about like giving your WMA a purpose. And so you can do a lot of these things through your WMA platform. It's the perfect place to do it. So for example, you could have a WMA meeting where your goal in that meeting is to prioritize a practice or a problem. You could hold a workshop, which would be to discuss and build a team. Like who needs to be at this workshop to see if they're available and interested and motivated. You could host a landowner workshop, which again, that's the big question, is make it worth their time. We've all been to those landowner workshops that were not worth anybody's time, and that happens, but you can do it. And then at the end of it, you can find the funding. So like right now, if you were to build this demand, you could propose a 2080 with IDOLs. You could utilize assignment of payment with existing NRCS programs. You could apply for RCPP grants, which is open this spring. But at the end of the day, if you create demand and you do it and you have truly good projects, the funding can come together if you think creatively. And the last slide, the actual last slide, and I'm right on time here, doing good, is we've now looked like, so this idea, the grouping sites together, the methodical outreach, like it was so successful to our team that we've been applying this other things. We've done urban soil quality restorations. We did 65 in a 6-week period our first year, and that grew to 150 last year, and we're going to do 250 this fall. We're doing an oxbow batch and build. We have a cover crop program that's pulling away some of the key parts. Wetlands, you cannot batch together and build multiple wetlands, but you can apply some of the methods about good landowner coordination. That's where we're going next, is to large constructed wetlands. And even stream restoration, arguably the most expensive practice, but we've been able to apply some of those same lessons, and the funding has followed suit. So sky's the limit of this idea of just make things simpler for landowners. And in some cases, like the soil quality restoration, landowners actually pay 50%. They just pay to the fiscal agents, and we group together costs and have decreased costs by 30% in that example. And with that, I'll end with cute pictures of my children, and hopefully we have a couple questions that we can go through, and now's the time to ask them. Happy to share.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And I've seen some questions already coming through the chat and the Q&A. So everybody online, please keep them coming. I do want to kind of ask you one before we get into that though, John. I'm seeing the names of who we have here today, and I'm really glad we've got some friendly faces on the call, WMA folks and folks from different agencies and entities, and just a lot of people that care about this topic. And as you know very well, the WMAs are all in kind of different positions. Maybe they have a part-time coordinator, or maybe they just got a plan written and they're just sort of at square one. Do you have any comments on that about a WMA who's looking at this and really excited, but maybe has less staff capacity today?
Yeah, so I've kind of been, I've been helping with our WMAs for 7 years now. And even within the 4 that I have, they're all incredibly different. They're different in financially, they're different in staffing, they're different. The one commonality is that they all appreciate a focused effort to get a project on the ground. And so the one thing with batch and build is it shows like you can do a little bit of everything, but you tend to not do anything well when you're doing that. And people kind of like, you kind of spin your wheels a little bit. The WMA focusing and prioritizing their effort, I think people they really appreciate that. And so like say like, hey, going into 2024, we really want to do this goal, and let's try and just accomplish that goal. And when you can get a WMA, like it provides the platform, not necessarily the money or like the staff, but if you create like that goal setting and you get people engaged, like this can provide a really good direction to get a good win under your belt. And then it's like, what do you do next? But without staffing, you have to have really engaged partners. And again, that's where it's important to find those motivated people who like know, like can either learn or know what they're doing.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Let's go ahead and start working our way through some of the questions, just in order. Vanya asked if a recording will be available, and the answer is yes. We have this recording now. We'll get this uploaded to YouTube in the next couple of days. And if you got all of the registration emails from us, you'll get the recording as well. So thank you for asking that.
Easy question, number 1.
Yeah, starting off with something we can handle. Thank you. And also, what agency does John work for? You're with Polk County, correct, John?
Yep, I'm with Polk County, but truly show a partnership. Like most landowners, most of the time they don't know who I am. We have like our project manager in the past has been with Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. We've also, but as I've went to other counties, they oftentimes didn't have staff that like had experience with this. So that's where I've helped kind of hold their hand, almost like walk them through how do you have these different meetings. But I'm with Polk County, and I tend to wander into other counties occasionally.
Love it. All right, next question. Did you survey aerially or remote sensing? You mentioned that when you reached out to landowners, you had already surveyed.
Yes, so what we used was here's a long name for it, Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework Tool. It's a GIS mapping tool developed in the Midwest. Iowa State, I believe, has mapped the entire state at this point. And it will give you fields where like the GIS, the online information has basically said of the high probability these practices will work in these fields. It goes from wetlands to saturated buffers to terraces and waterways. So we never really knew how to use it. So what we did is we went through and we analyzed every field that had a saturated buffer hit, which basically that meant it had good soil characteristics. It had proper bed depth and a few other characters. And so we then made a map for every landowner. We found their contact information. We sent them the letter, including the map, so they could know what field we were talking about. And so from that, you make a cold call, and whether you could get them on the phone or not was basically the biggest indicator. If you could get them on the phone, you had like a 50-50 shot. If you didn't get them on the phone, it was almost impossible. So once they're on the phone, we said, hey, we mapped out, your field was identified. If you would be open to, we'd like to go out and actually physically survey your tile and get the depth and grade of it. We have to make sure, for example, we're not going to flood your field by messing with your tile. And that was the next field survey aspect. And I'd say so if you have a 50-50 shot at getting in the field, and then you probably have a 50-50 roughly of every tile that you survey is going to make it to the finish line. So if we want to install 50, we're going to need to survey at least field survey at least 100 sites, because they won't make it through design. A landowner won't, they'll back out for whatever reason. So those are all some general rules that we learned along the way. Long answer.
No, that's really helpful. Next question's from Taylor. Maybe I missed this, but is this with absentee landowners or are people that are actively farming included in the group of landowners you targeted?
Absolutely. So what we did is before we sent each letter, we did almost like a little background investigation, like who was the landowner? Where do they live? Who's their farmer? Do we know anybody that knows them? If we knew the farmer, we might call the farmer first and ask them about this landowner. If we didn't, sometimes we just shoot it, like just send the letter, and we'd be calling somebody in Oregon. And what was fun is like in the past, a lot of times we always targeted the farmers. In this case, we were almost entirely targeting the landowner. And we had a lot of, actually more than ever, absentee landowners that were like, yeah, that sounds interesting, go for it. And eventually, like we then learned that we also need to always talk with the farmer. But we got for the first time actually good absentee landowner participation, which did make it really hard for filling out paperwork, but we worked through that as well. So a little bit of everything. Classic, like when you had a landowner who was also the farmer, like it's always the best case scenario. And that was some of our early wins were that, but we've gotten really outside the box with that in recent last couple of years.
Very interesting. And something I've appreciated, John, as I've learned about this project over the years is, as you've said, you just try to make it really easy to say yes, like set them up, with the questions they have and set them up with information they need. And that's really awesome.
Unless they want more on that note, we only talk to them 3 times. We have an initial cold call. We have a formal sit down with them when we have feasibility, and then we have a final sign up. Now, most landowners want more than that, but for some of them, that was all it took. And they appreciated that simplicity of those conversations.
All right. A question from Susan. Does your cluster of projects provide more measurable stream outcomes?
So for the first time, so we actually had so we've done there's been a lot of statewide, a lot of individual practice, like they monitor one tile, they install a saturated buffer and they measure the benefits. Same thing with bioreactors. So like, to me, it's proven science at this point, like what your expected outcome, like you're gonna expect around a 60% reduction. We've seen upwards of a 90 in some case for some saturated buffers, but we know how efficient a single practice is going to be. We've been doing a study in 4 Mile Creek where we had about a mile stretch, 1.5 miles, where we treated every single tile outlet, and we have installed a nitrate sensor on the downstream side of that. So we have our good pre-data, we installed all the practices, and now we're hoping to see some real world, like across a longer section of stream moving forward as we get that data moving in the next couple of years.
Very good. Another question from Vanya. How economically efficient is batching landowners together? And how many do you need to batch together to be economically viable?
Yes. So depending on how you define economically viable, to me, it was really like on a big scale, like, is it worth paying the $1,000 incentive payment per tile? We've done groupings as small as 10 and as big as 50. I tell like new counties, I think 25 is a good starter batch. That's like very worth your time, but not like huge. But across the board, we've seen like beneficial like cost reductions from grouping sites together. The more you can cluster them geographically, the better. If you're going to spread them out, it may still get you practices on the ground, but you're going to lose some of those cost savings. And then if you think about the investment of these practices specifically, like we always focus on saturated buffers first whenever possible because of their long lifespan and they're significantly lower cost than bioreactors. But that being said, we look first saturated buffer. If that doesn't work, we'll look, would a bioreactor work? If that doesn't work, then it's a no-go. And we've set thresholds now as we've really honed this in. Like we want at least 15 acres for saturated buffers. We want at least 30 acres for a bioreactor. And now we also put a wetland hat on when we're out there, and we've been identifying wetland sites, which to me is all of them when we're out there.
A follow-up question to that, how do you set those thresholds and those goals that you have? Where those numbers coming from?
So a lot of it comes to like talking to the experts. Like I'm not an expert in research. I'm an expert in like putting projects together. So we've spent a lot of time talking with IDOLs and NRCS and Iowa State about like what's worthwhile. And as we like for the first time, we have so many sites that we can be a little bit pickier. And so that first year we surveyed every tile that we found. Going to our second, third year, we now can like look like, okay, this tile is not going to have a big enough drainage area, not worth our time, moving on. So we some of those have also trickled down to being more efficient in the field, which now is a big win. Everything you can do to be more efficient with your time is going to be better in the long run because you can spend that time on other stuff now. Good questions.
All right. Yeah, keep them coming, everybody. We've still got some time. Matthew asks, what determines where batch and build projects occur?
Yeah, so I'm sitting in Polk County. I have ventured into neighboring counties like out of cohesive interest. I guess I would call it that. The state IDOL specifically has really supported this batch and build from it being like a crazy idea to now being like a rather documented. And I think the last I heard, Tanner Pulse is kind of the point person for saturated buffers and bioreactors. But to me, the reality of it is like, where can you form a team that can check all the boxes? So in some areas you have like a great survey outreach team, but you don't have a good designer. In other times you have that, but you don't have a good conservation planner. Like, I think if you can check all those boxes, you have a very viable pitch to like IDOLs is the low hanging fruit if you want to do edge of field stuff. But the Des Moines lobe is also going to be your most, if you're talking edge of field structures, Des Moines lobe is going to be your best bets. But I've been talking with Dubuque. I was talking to Dubuque County and city about doing a prairie strips batch and build. I've talked to some folks in Wisconsin about doing a cover crops batch and build. Like there's other practices. It's just like some of it is just this idea of targeting.
So really, if you had to distill it down, it's about simplifying efficiency and just focusing on one or maybe a very short list of practices. Is that right?
Yes, that's what I would highly recommend. And then you develop your timeline and goals and like figure out the funding for that specific. And then if you don't get past landowner outreach, then you failed, which is okay. Then you might have to like recalibrate and do something else. But it's about like that focus effort and like really drumming down to like, what would it take? I really want to do a livestock exclusion. I want to go out and ask every landowner, like, what would it take to get cattle out of our streams? And that's kind of one of the things on my mind. And very easy to target.
Awesome. Awesome. These are both from Matthew. I'm going to ask them together. Is there any interest in assessing the nitrate levels in the tiles being considered? And is there funding for landowners that do not have row crop, but pasture or grasslands or something like that?
Yeah. So in our first year, we actually did a grab sample and worked with Iowa Soybean Association on every tile to try and deem if we were at like a viable threshold, like, is it worth us treating? And what we found with those that were draining row crops is, again, I tend to rely on the experts. We sent it to the scientists, and every one of those sites, they deemed, yes, it was worth it. So we quit doing that moving forward. However, the sites that drain just grasslands, we saw very minimal nutrient reduction, nutrient loads. So we do not treat tile that drain only pasture or only grass However, we do build stuff in pastures and grass if they're draining adjacent croplands. So what I learned through that was like row crop corn bean is what we want to treat. And it can be in a pasture, but we don't want to treat tile that are just draining a pasture or grasslands.
All right, another one here. Can you speak more to the cover crop program you briefly mentioned earlier? How does the batch and build method play out with that program?
Absolutely. So I'll start this one off with stating that I am not a soil health expert. I work with soil health experts and cover crop experts. But we were hearing really good things coming out of several counties that were doing they call them like one-stop cover crop shops where folks can roll into an office. The district many times would line up an airplane. They would line up what seed you want. And they would take off again, check a box, sign your name, write a check. That level of simplicity. Well, that idea was kind of in our team's head. And then we also learned about in Kansas how they were purchasing high clearance cover crops, these sprayers, high boys, and they were retrofitting them for seeding cover crops. Long story short, we worked out a partnership where Polk County purchased the first production model off the line high boy cover crop seeder. And then we now lease it to a local co-op who runs the program for us. And where the efficiency was for me on that end was the same people who are selling everything else to the farmers and landowners are also selling cover crops. And we've seen that partnership work very well. And they have conservation agronomists, and I have nothing but good things to say about my experiences with them. Now, the future of that, where like our district's been really talking about, district staff have been talking about, is that same idea that folks could come into the office, they could check how they would like their cover crops applied. All the programs are there. They can apply from all at once and it just be taken care of. And that's kind of the vision as like the next step, because we know aerial's an option. We have somebody that can drill. We have the high clearance seeder that can do it earlier in the season. We haven't got to that level yet, but that's where we want to go. People can go in and check, good to go, and then follow up. That's where we've been missing the boat, I think, a lot, is we have not been following up good enough to say, how was your experience and how can it be improved?
All right, another question kind of coming from Polk SWCD. Can you explain how CRP and edge of field can work together, since CRP is often located along creeks or streams?
Excellent question. And so first off, I'll note that our first year, we actually only targeted fields that had existing buffers, because right there, you're halfway there, right? You have a buffer, you just want to put these in the buffer. We've also learned now, like, how do you add a buffer and do these practices? But most of those buffers are in CRP. And this is where we had a lot of misinformation out there, like even just 3 years ago. So a lot of counties were telling folks that you were not allowed to add a saturated buffer, say, into a filter strip until the end of contract. Turns out we had to go all the way to the top. That was not true. So we had a memo got issued statewide that you can, in a CP21 filter strip, add a saturated buffer or bioreactor anytime. And it doesn't change the payment. It doesn't change the terms. It doesn't change anything. You're just simply adding it to it. Take that conversation further. Maybe they put in a quail buffer. You absolutely are not allowed to put a saturated buffer into a quail buffer. I have strong arguments against that, but like, that's the rules until the rules change. So you have to really know the rules. The same thing goes for, there's clear money available. So through CRP, CP21S Clear Initiative, you can actually get 100% of the cost covered for a saturated buffer or bioreactor. Although after years of trying, we have tried to figure out the assignment of payments that's a funding source that's sitting out there. I'm kind of come to the conclusion there's no way to get that funding from FSA to a batch and build. However, that would be an opportunity for a landowner if they wanted to hire their own contractor and do it themselves. But it's rather complicated. So there's several angles there, but knowing your local FSA office, like, there's a person there that's going to have to update the CRP contract, and you better not go to them and say, I need all these contracts updated like in the next 3 weeks. Like, that's not fair to them. So we usually try to meet with them early and ask them, like, how long do you think you would need to update? And they might say a month, they might say 3 months, and whatever they say, we try to meet that deadline for them, and then we hold each other accountable.
Awesome. We have time that's just right. I think that was our last question, and we're right at time. I do want to just read you an email I got this morning, John, which is from Jen Fensel, and she says, we can share that the lower cedar WMA as a version of the brilliant program that you all have done. Theirs is funded by ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act funding, from 2 counties. Imitation is the best form of flattery. So I just wanted to share that and give you one opportunity to just, where are we headed with this? What are you excited about? What's on the horizon with Batch and Build?
Yeah, I've been hearing really good things coming out of, like, again, funny stories. Like, I had a couple coordinators I've known for years. They called me from Northern Iowa and they're like, John, that sounds cool, but that would never work up here. Several of those folks have called me because they were kind of directed to try it out. And it's like, the landowners have been very positive. Like, everyone I hear has been really positive. And I've been here, I think the Cedar River watershed is going to blow our numbers out of the water, which is awesome, pun intended. And again, I think, but again, everyone has to be on the same page. There are still folks out there that, like, when you talk edge of field, they don't really believe in the practices. And like, that's only going to come through time and good conversations. I also firmly believe that, like, saturated buffers and bioreactors aren't the answer to everything, but they're a tool. So we have to, like, do this for all different practices, but it's really exciting. I feel like a little bit refreshed as a conservationist, because it can be such a negative rhetoric around this work. Some real positive stories coming out of it. So it's been fun.
Awesome. Let's sneak in one last question from Matt. He was told you can't use EQIP funding to build a bioreactor on CP 21, which is approved for bioreactor. Have you had this scenario pop up? What'd you do?
That is correct. You can't, so here's a good one for you. Like, programmatic guidelines. You cannot use EQIP or RCPP or any other federal funds on an existing federally contracted CRP land. However, if you think about the resource concern, a filter strip is managing surface runoff. The tile is taking subsurface runoff. So you're treating 2 different resource concerns. So there's an argument that we've made, and they simply said, nope, not allowed. So as it says right now, we only use EQIP or RCPP if it's not in CRP. And then we actually, we found that you can use an assignment of payment if you want to do a batch and build, but it will roughly double your paperwork. So we only do it if people are really comfortable with government programs. If they've never used a federal program before, we would probably never use that funding, but it's out there. It's a good funding source if you like paperwork.
Which I'm getting the sense you don't, John, but you make it work.
Absolutely not.
All right. Well, thank you again for making the time, and thanks to everybody for calling in. I think the last comment I want to make is that I think both John and I are open to keeping these conversations going, and we're really excited about the idea of this work happening in more and more places in Iowa and even beyond. If you have questions that we can address, my information will definitely be in that follow-up email we send. John, if you're comfortable, I might throw your email address in there as well.
Yeah.
But please do reach out and let's stay in touch, because really that hands-on experience is what keeps these things going and improves them along the way. So thank you, John, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.